So NAS is sort of another type of aromatic substitution that we're going to learn for arenes like benzene rings that builds upon the ideas of EAS, electrophilic aromatic substitution. So NAS stands for nucleophilic aromatic substitution. And overall, what you're going to see is that some arene, often a benzene ring, with a leaving group, is treated with a nucleophile. There will often be other substituents in certain positions on this. So overall, the process is pretty simple, where nucleophile is simply leaving group. But the caveat is that this is not via SN1 nor SN2. But instead, it's via a mechanism called SNAR, nucleophilic aromatic substitution.